The trade that hurt your account the most probably didn't fail because of the exit. It likely failed before you ever clicked the button. That sounds strange, doesn't it? Because when traders review losses, they usually focus on where they should have taken profit, where they should have cut risk, or how the market suddenly changed. But there's a hidden cost that often goes unnoticed entering a trade that never truly earned the right to be taken. Have you ever looked back at a losing position and realized the market never gave you a clear reason to be there in the first place? That is where the conversation begins. An entry rule is not just a signal, it is a filter. It decides which opportunities deserve your capital and which deserve your patience. The market offers movement every day. It offers noise every minute. Without a strict entry rule, you start treating movement as opportunity. The result is predictable. More trades, more emotional decisions, more exposure to randomness, and then something interesting happens. You begin blaming outcomes instead of decisions. Why? Because once you're in a trade, your attention shifts to profit and loss. But the quality of the trade was determined before that moment. The seed was planted at entry. So ask yourself this: are you reacting to price, or are you responding to a condition that repeatedly proves itself? That distinction changes everything. Strong traders understand that money is not made by participating in every move. It is made by participating in specific moves under specific conditions. When price breaks a level, what happens next? Does volume support it? Does the market accept the new price area? Does momentum expand or immediately fade? These observations matter because entries are really about probability, not prediction. You do not need to know what happens next. You need evidence that the odds have shifted. Notice how this changes your psychology. When your entry rule is vague, every candle becomes a debate. Every pullback feels threatening. Every small fluctuation demands attention. But when your entry rule is precise, uncertainty becomes easier to manage. Why? Because you are no longer trading opinions. You are trading conditions. A practical exercise is simple. Review your last 20 trades. Separate them into two groups. Trades that followed your exact entry criteria and trades that involved improvisation. Which group performed better? The answer is often uncomfortable. Not because the losses disappear, but because consistency becomes visible. The market rewards discipline long before it rewards prediction. And here is the deeper implication. A weak entry rule creates emotional exits. A strong entry rule supports rational exits. Cause and effect. The trader who enters from impatience usually manages the trade from fear. The trader who enters from evidence has a much better chance of managing from confidence. Can you see why so many performance problems are actually entry problems wearing different masks? Overtrading often begins with loose entries. Revenge trading often begins with poor entries. Lack of confidence often begins with poor entries. Change the standard at the front end, and many problems downstream start shrinking on their own. The question is not whether your next trade wins. The question is whether the market presents the exact conditions your rule requires. And when you reach the point where passing on a trade feels just as productive as taking one, you begin to understand something that separates experienced operators from hopeful participants. Because the real edge is not finding more trades. A surprising number of execution mistakes happen before the trade is executed. Not after. Before. The order goes through exactly as intended. The platform works. The position size is correct. The stop is placed where it belongs. Yet the trade was still poorly executed. How is that possible? Because traders often confuse execution with order placement. They think execution begins when they click the button. In reality, execution begins much earlier. Execution begins the moment you decide what conditions must exist before you act. Consider the difference between a hunter and someone chasing movement through the woods. Both are moving, both are active. But one is following a process while the other is following excitement. The market creates endless opportunities to react. Price moves, candles expand, news appears, momentum accelerates. If your only definition of execution is entering quickly, then speed becomes your priority. And speed without preparation usually leads to inconsistency. Think about it. How many times have you entered a trade simply because something was happening? not because your conditions were present, but because activity itself felt persuasive. That is where execution starts breaking down. Good execution is not the ability to act fast. It is the ability to act only when the required conditions are visible. This distinction matters because markets rarely announce their intentions clearly. They offer clues, fragments of information, and developing situations. The trader's job is not to respond to every clue. The trader's job is to wait until enough evidence has accumulated to justify action. When that standard is absent, execution becomes reactive, and reactive execution creates a chain reaction. You see movement, so you enter. Because the entry was rushed, the location is often poor. Because the location is poor, price immediately creates discomfort. Because discomfort appears, attention shifts away from observation and toward managing the consequences of entering too soon. The entire sequence began with execution, not with analysis, not with the market. Execution. Have you noticed how experienced traders often appear slower than everyone else? It is not because they hesitate. It is because they have already decided what they are waiting for. The decision was made before the opportunity appeared. When the market finally presents the required conditions, action becomes simple. There is no debate, no negotiation, no last-second interpretation. The market either qualifies or it doesn't. That is what precision looks like. Precision is often misunderstood as accuracy. It is actually selectivity. A precise trader is not trying to enter at the exact bottom or exact top. A precise trader is entering at the point where predefined conditions align. The effect is subtle but powerful. Instead of constantly asking, "Should I enter now?" the question becomes, "Has the market completed the process I require?" One question invites impulse. The other demands evidence. Over time, this changes the quality of execution dramatically. You stop measuring execution by how efficiently orders are placed. You start measuring execution by how consistently standards are applied. The market may move without you. Sometimes it will move exactly where you expected before your conditions appear. That is not a failure of execution. In many cases, it is evidence of good execution. Why? Because execution is not about capturing every move. Execution is about maintaining the discipline to participate only when the market has earned your involvement. Once that principle becomes part of your process, you begin to see that the best executions often feel uneventful. There is no rush, no urgency, no sense of chasing. The market offers thousands of possible trades. Your edge exists in only a small fraction of them. That fact sounds obvious, yet traders spend years behaving as though opportunity itself is an advantage. They search for more setups, more indicators, more markets, and more activity. But the market has never paid traders for finding opportunities. It pays them for selecting the right ones. There is an important difference. A fisherman does not improve his results by casting into every part of the ocean. He improves them by understanding where conditions favor his catch. Trading works the same way. The quality of your results depends less on how many opportunities you find and more on how effectively you filter them. Have you ever noticed that two traders can look at the same chart and see entirely different opportunities? One sees a trade. The other sees a situation that does not meet his standards. The difference is not vision. The difference is selection. This is where the concept of edge is often misunderstood. Many traders think edge is something they add to the market, a special indicator, a unique pattern, a superior prediction. In reality, edge often comes from what you refuse to trade. Every market contains a mixture of favorable and unfavorable conditions. Your job is not to transform poor conditions into good trades. Your job is to identify the small environments where probabilities are tilted slightly in your favor. That tilt may seem insignificant, but small advantages become meaningful when they are applied repeatedly. This is why selection matters more than people realize. Imagine two traders using the exact same strategy. The first trader takes every signal. The second trader only takes signals that appear under specific supporting conditions. The strategy is identical. The outcomes are not. Why? Because the edge was never in the signal alone. The edge was in the selection process surrounding the signal. A signal simply points toward a possibility. Selection determines whether that possibility deserves capital. This creates an uncomfortable realization. The majority of available trades are irrelevant. Not bad, not good, just irrelevant. They do not offer enough advantage to justify participation. The market does not care that a setup looks interesting. The market does not care that a chart appears attractive. The market only responds to actual buying and selling pressure. As traders mature, they begin spending less time searching for reasons to enter and more time searching for reasons to exclude. That shift changes everything, because every condition you require acts like another layer of filtration. Each layer removes weaker opportunities. Each layer reduces exposure to randomness. Each layer narrows your focus toward situations where your edge has historically appeared. Can this feel restrictive? At first, yes. The market is constantly presenting possibilities, and filtering naturally reduces activity. But that reduction is precisely the point. A casino does not gain its advantage by betting on every event in the world. It gains its advantage by participating only in games where probabilities favor the house. Trading demands the same mindset. The goal is not to create opportunity. The goal is to recognize when opportunity already contains favorable conditions. Once you understand this, your relationship with charts begins to change. Instead of asking, "What can I trade today?" you begin asking, "Which opportunities belong to my edge and which do not?" One question expands your attention toward everything. The other narrows your attention toward what matters. Price moves first. Evidence comes later. This simple fact creates one of the most important challenges in trading. The market rarely presents certainty before it moves. If it did, everyone would participate at the same time and opportunity would disappear. Instead, the market reveals information gradually. It unfolds through behavior. The question is not whether price is moving. The question is whether the market has proven enough to justify your involvement. That is a very different standard. Many traders become interested in a trade because they anticipate what the market might do. They see a level, a pattern, or a possibility and immediately begin building a case for participation. But markets do not reward possibilities. Markets reward correct interpretations of actual behavior. Have you noticed how often a chart appears ready to move, only to do nothing? Or worse, move briefly before reversing? The lesson is not that analysis is useless. The lesson is that expectation alone is weak evidence. The market must contribute something to the conversation. It must reveal information that was not present before. Think of a courtroom. A theory may sound convincing, but a theory without evidence remains a theory. The burden of proof still exists. Trading works much the same way. The market makes a claim through price movement. Your job is to decide whether the claim has been supported by enough evidence. This shifts the focus away from prediction and toward observation. Instead of asking, "Where do I think price will go?" you begin asking, "What has the market demonstrated?" The difference may seem subtle, but it changes the entire process. Because demonstrated behavior carries more weight than anticipated behavior. A breakout is not evidence simply because price touches a level. A breakout becomes evidence when the market shows acceptance beyond that level. Momentum is not evidence because a candle becomes large. Momentum becomes evidence when expansion continues rather than immediately collapsing. Strength is not evidence because buyers appear for a moment. Strength becomes evidence when buying pressure continues influencing price after the initial move. Do you see the pattern? The market must prove persistence, not merely activity. Anyone can push a market briefly. What matters is whether the move attracts participation that sustains itself. This is why experienced traders spend so much time watching what happens after important events. The first reaction often attracts attention. The follow-through reveals information, and information is what matters. Every meaningful entry condition is ultimately built around proof. Proof that buyers are gaining control. Proof that sellers are losing influence. Proof that a previous condition has changed. Proof that the market is behaving differently than it was before. Without proof, you are left with possibility, and possibility exists everywhere. The market produces endless possibilities every day. What it produces far less frequently is meaningful evidence. That distinction explains why patience is often rewarded. Not because waiting is inherently valuable, but because evidence takes time to emerge. The market cannot prove something before it happens. It can only prove it through behavior as it unfolds. This creates a practical challenge. Evidence is rarely perfect. Markets are dynamic, not mechanical. You are not waiting for certainty. You are waiting for enough proof to justify action. That threshold matters. Require too little proof, and you participate before the market has revealed itself. Require too much proof, and valuable opportunities pass without you. The skill lies in understanding which behaviors genuinely change the odds and which behaviors merely create excitement. As you spend more time studying price, you begin noticing that the market constantly communicates its intentions through actions rather than predictions. It tells you something through acceptance. It tells you something through rejection. It tells you something through continuation. It tells you something through failure. The market charges a price for every decision, not just the wrong ones. Every decision carries a cost because every decision commits capital, attention, and opportunity. The problem is that traders often focus on the visible costs while ignoring the invisible ones. A losing trade is visible. A missed opportunity elsewhere is not. Capital tied up in a weak position is visible only after the fact. Time spent managing a trade that never deserved attention is rarely measured at all. This is why acting without sufficient evidence is so expensive. The loss is often larger than the number displayed on the screen. When evidence is limited, uncertainty increases. When uncertainty increases, outcomes become more dependent on chance. And when outcomes become more dependent on chance, the quality of the decision declines regardless of whether the trade eventually wins or loses. That distinction matters. Because the market occasionally rewards poor decisions, a trader enters early, guesses correctly, and profits. The result appears positive. The process was not. Have you ever seen someone make money for the wrong reason? Of course. It happens in every profession. Trading is no different. A favorable outcome does not automatically validate the decision that produced it. The real question is simpler. What information justified the commitment? The strength of a decision depends on the strength of the evidence supporting it. Nothing more. Nothing less. Imagine making a large business investment based on a rumor rather than verified information. The investment might succeed, but you would still recognize the weakness of the process. Trading often disguises this weakness because feedback arrives quickly. A profitable trade creates the illusion that insufficient evidence was enough. That illusion becomes dangerous. Why? Because repeated exposure to weak evidence trains a trader to lower standards. Lower standards lead to more commitments. More commitments create greater exposure to uncertainty. Greater exposure to uncertainty makes results increasingly inconsistent. The entire chain begins with evidence. This is why experienced traders become skeptical of attractive possibilities, not because possibilities are worthless, because possibilities are abundant. Evidence is scarce. The market constantly offers reasons to become interested. It offers far fewer reasons to become involved. Those are not the same thing. Interest requires curiosity. Participation requires justification. The gap between those two ideas is where many costly decisions originate. Consider how often price approaches a level, forms a recognizable pattern, or creates a compelling story. At that moment, the temptation is to treat expectation as proof. But expectation only describes what might happen. Evidence describes what is actually happening. The difference may seem small, yet it changes the quality of every decision. One is built on projection. The other is built on observation. And markets have a habit of punishing projections that are unsupported by behavior. This does not mean waiting for certainty. Certainty does not exist. The goal is not certainty. The goal is sufficient evidence. Enough information to justify participation. Enough information to distinguish a developing opportunity from a random fluctuation. Enough information to make the decision defensible regardless of the eventual outcome. Can you see how this changes the way opportunities are evaluated? Instead of asking whether a trade could work, you begin asking whether the market has provided enough information to support involvement. That is a completely different standard. One invites speculation. The other demands validation. Over time, this habit becomes valuable because it shifts attention away from predictions and toward qualifications. The market no longer needs to look promising. It needs to demonstrate something. It needs to reveal behavior that supports the commitment being requested. Because every time capital enters the market, a decision is being made. One of the biggest differences between amateur and professional trading is not knowledge. It is the number of decisions made in real time. Watch an inexperienced trader long enough, and you will notice a constant negotiation taking place. Every setup becomes a discussion. Every chart becomes a debate. Every opportunity requires interpretation in the moment. The market presents information. The trader argues with himself about what it means. Professionals approach the process differently. They do not eliminate decision-making. They relocate it. That distinction is important. The amateur decides during the trade. The professional decides before the trade. Why does this matter? Because the quality of a decision changes when it is made under different conditions. Before the market opens, the mind is relatively calm. The chart is simply information. There is no position, no profit, no loss, no urgency. Once the market begins moving, everything changes. Price starts influencing perception. Movement creates pressure. Opportunity appears temporary. And suddenly decisions become more difficult. The same trader who appeared rational an hour ago is now negotiating with himself. This is exactly why professionals rely on rules. Not because rules predict the future, because rules remove unnecessary negotiations. A rule acts like a decision made in advance. It answers a question before the market asks it. Think about what happens when no rule exists. Price approaches an area of interest. Now the internal conversation begins. Maybe this is enough. Maybe it will move without me. Maybe I should enter a little early. Maybe the conditions don't need to be perfect. The market has not changed. Only the negotiation has begun. And negotiation introduces inconsistency. The problem with inconsistency is that it quietly changes standards. One day a condition is required. The next day it becomes optional. The day after that it is ignored completely. Soon the trader is no longer following a process. He is following a series of temporary judgments. Professionals understand something valuable. Temporary judgments fluctuate. Rules endure. That endurance creates stability. The purpose of an entry rule is not merely to identify opportunities. Its deeper purpose is to preserve standards. A standard that must be reapproved every day is not really a standard. A standard only becomes meaningful when it survives changing moods, changing market conditions, and changing levels of confidence. Have you ever noticed how easy it is to justify a trade when you want to take it? The mind is remarkably creative. It can build convincing arguments for almost anything. That is why relying on interpretation alone becomes dangerous. Interpretation tends to expand when opportunity appears. Rules tend to remain fixed. This creates an important advantage. When conditions are predefined, the market either qualifies or it does not. There is less room for persuasion, less room for exceptions, less room for adjusting standards to fit a desired outcome. Over time, this changes the daily experience of trading. Energy is no longer spent debating every possibility. Attention shifts toward observation. The trader spends less time asking what he should do and more time determining whether predefined requirements have been satisfied. That may sound like a small difference. It is not. Decision fatigue accumulates. Every unnecessary judgment consumes mental resources. Every negotiation demands attention. Every exception creates another precedent. Eventually, the process becomes heavier than it needs to be. Rules solve this problem by reducing the number of decisions that require active evaluation. Not every decision. Only the ones that should have been settled long ago. The result is a more efficient process. The trader is not constantly inventing responses to market conditions. The responses already exist. The market simply determines whether they are activated. And when enough of these decisions are moved out of the moment and into the structure of the process itself, something interesting begins to happen. Traders often treat entry and exit as separate skills. They study entries in one conversation and exits in another, as though the two exist independently. The market does not see them that way. In reality, the quality of an exit is often influenced by the quality of the entry that came before it. A difficult trade frequently begins with a difficult entry. A manageable trade frequently begins with a well qualified one. This relationship is easy to overlook because the exit happens later. When problems appear, attention naturally focuses on the point where the discomfort is being felt, but cause and effect rarely begin at the point of discomfort. They usually begin much earlier. Think about what happens when a trader enters before the market has provided enough confirmation. The position is now active, but the market's intentions remain unclear. Because uncertainty remains high, every price movement carries more significance. A small pullback feels important. A brief pause feels suspicious. A minor fluctuation demands interpretation. The trader is forced to make continuous exit decisions because the original position was established before the situation became clear. The trade requires constant management because it was entered under uncertain conditions. Now consider the opposite. The market demonstrates the required behavior. Conditions align. The trade is entered only after sufficient confirmation exists. Has risk disappeared? Of course not. But something important has changed. The position begins with stronger information supporting it. Because the information is stronger, normal price fluctuations become easier to interpret. The trader is less likely to react to every movement because the trade was built on more substantial evidence from the beginning. This creates an important chain reaction. Better entry quality leads to greater clarity. Greater clarity leads to fewer unnecessary adjustments. Fewer unnecessary adjustments lead to more consistent trade management. The process becomes simpler. Not because exits have become easier in isolation, because the foundation supporting them has improved. Have you ever noticed how some trades seem to create endless decisions? The trader adjusts targets, moves stops, questions every candle, reevaluates the position repeatedly. The trade becomes a constant source of management. Meanwhile, other trades seem almost cooperative. The market behaves as expected. Key areas remain intact. Important assumptions remain valid. The trader still manages the position, but the management feels cleaner. The difference is often rooted in the information available at entry. A position entered under weak conditions requires continuous verification. A position entered under stronger conditions begins with much of that verification already completed. This does not guarantee success. No entry can guarantee success. The market always retains the right to invalidate a trade. But there is a meaningful difference between managing a trade that fails after meeting strong conditions and managing a trade that never possessed strong conditions to begin with. One represents market uncertainty. The other represents informational weakness. Those are not the same problem. Experienced traders learn to appreciate this distinction. They understand that trade management becomes increasingly difficult when the original case for participation is fragile. Every new piece of market information forces another reassessment. Every fluctuation invites another question. The position demands attention because its foundation was never fully established. Strong entries reduce this burden, not by eliminating uncertainty, but by reducing unnecessary uncertainty. The market still needs to prove itself after entry, but it no longer needs to prove the basic premise of the trade. That work has already been done. This changes the role of trade management entirely. Management stops becoming a process of constantly validating the position. It becomes a process of responding to new information while the original thesis remains intact. The distinction may appear subtle, yet it affects every stage of the trade. Some trading mistakes are obvious. A trader ignores risk. A trader increases size recklessly. A trader refuses to accept a loss. Those mistakes are easy to identify because the damage is visible. But there is another mistake that quietly drains performance while often appearing completely reasonable. Entering on possibility instead of confirmation. The danger is that possibility usually looks attractive. In fact, it often looks almost identical to opportunity. A chart begins setting up. Price approaches an important area. Momentum starts building. The market appears ready to move. At that moment, the mind naturally starts projecting forward. You begin imagining what could happen next. And that is where the mistake begins. Not because possibility is wrong, because possibility exists long before confirmation arrives. Every significant market move begins as a possibility. The problem is that countless failed moves begin the same way. Before a breakout succeeds, it is a possibility. Before a breakout fails, it is also a possibility. Before a trend develops, it is a possibility.